My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I never imagined that packing my grandmother's house would uncover a web of lies that had been suffocating my family for months. The October rain drummed relentlessly against the windows of the old Victorian home in Portland, Oregon, creating a melancholy soundtrack to what I believed would be my final week in this place that had been my sanctuary for so many years. Grandma Rose had passed away 3 months ago on a humid July morning, and I'd been putting off this inevitable task of sorting through her belongings. The grief was still too raw, too overwhelming. Every corner of this house held memories of the woman who had raised me, loved me, and made me feel like I belonged somewhere in this world. The lawyers had already read her will back in August. Everything went to my Uncle Marcus, her only surviving child. My mother had died when I was 12 in a car accident that shattered our family, and apparently, that tragic loss meant I got nothing from Grandma Rose's estate, not even a family heirloom, a piece of jewelry, or a photograph. Marcus had made it crystal clear during our awkward conversation after the funeral. I had 1 week to collect any personal items I wanted, then the house would go on the market. "I know it seems harsh, Sarah," he had said, avoiding my eyes as we stood in the kitchen where Grandma Rose had taught me to bake cookies. "But Mom was very specific in her will. She left everything to me, and I need to settle the estate quickly. I have some business investments that require immediate attention." I stood now in the dusty attic, surrounded by decades of memories packed into cardboard boxes and covered in white sheets that looked like ghosts in the dim light. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet with each step, protesting under the weight of my movement and the burden of time itself. I'd been up here for nearly 4 hours, going through photo albums that chronicled a life well lived, finding pieces of my childhood I'd forgotten, report cards Grandma Rose had saved, artwork from elementary school, letters I'd written to her during my college years. The house felt impossibly empty without her warm presence filling every room. I could almost hear her voice calling me down for her famous apple pie, the one she made every Sunday after church. I could almost see her sitting in her favorite armchair by the fireplace, knitting while watching her evening shows, humming softly to herself. She'd raised me after Mom died, stepping in when my father couldn't handle the responsibility of a grieving 12-year-old girl. This house had been my sanctuary during the darkest period of my life, and now I was being forced to leave it forever. The financial reality of my situation made everything worse. At 28, I was barely making ends meet on my elementary school teacher's salary. I had student loans, credit card debt, and a car that needed repairs I couldn't afford. The inheritance would have changed everything, given me the security and stability I'd been desperately seeking. Instead, I was facing the prospect of starting over with nothing but memories and a growing sense of abandonment. I was reaching for a box labeled Helen's Things in my mother's familiar handwriting when my elbow knocked against an old wooden trunk that had been pushed against the far wall. The trunk was beautiful, made of rich mahogany with brass corners and an intricate lock that looked like it belonged in a museum. The impact of my elbow caused something unexpected to happen. A hidden compartment at the bottom slid open slightly, revealing a narrow gap I'd never noticed before. My heart skipped a beat as I noticed the corner of some papers sticking out from the opening. This trunk had been in the attic for as long as I could remember, and I'd played around it as a child, using it as a pirate's treasure chest during games of make-believe. How had I never discovered this secret compartment? Curious and slightly breathless, I knelt down on the dusty floor and carefully pulled out what appeared to be legal documents. The papers were yellowed with age and felt delicate in my hands. As I unfolded them with trembling fingers, my breath caught in my throat. At the top, printed in formal legal letterhead, I read, "Last Will and Testament of Rose Margaret Thompson." But that was impossible. I'd been present when the lawyers read her will just 3 months ago, in their sterile conference room downtown. This document was dated only 6 months before her death, much more recent than the will that had been probated. The date showed it had been prepared in January, while the will that had been read to us was from 3 years earlier. My hands trembled as I read the contents under the dim light filtering through the small attic window. According to this document, everything, the house worth nearly $800,000, her savings account with over $200,000, her investment portfolio, even her collection of vintage jewelry, was left to me, not to Uncle Marcus. To me, Sarah Mitchell, the granddaughter of my heart. The will was signed in Grandma Rose's distinctive handwriting, notarized with an official seal, and appeared completely legitimate. There were two witnesses listed, Margaret Foster and David Chen, names I didn't recognize, but which sounded official and proper. There was even a handwritten note attached in Grandma Rose's familiar script, "For my dear Sarah, who brought light back into my life when I thought all hope was lost. You are the daughter of my heart, and this house has always been yours. I pray you will fill it with love and laughter as you have filled my life with joy." I sat back on my heels, stunned into silence. The words on the page blurred as tears filled my eyes. This was the grandmother I remembered, the woman who had told me countless times that I was her greatest treasure. But why hadn't this will been found? Why had the lawyers only presented the older version? The date on this document clearly showed it superseded the previous will, making it the valid legal document that should have been probated. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hey Sarah, how's the packing going? I hate to rush you, but I really need you to be out by Sunday. The realtor wants to do a walkthrough on Monday morning, and I've got potential buyers interested. The sooner we can close, the better." I stared at the message on my screen, then back at the documents in my hands. The casual tone of his text, the pressure to hurry, the emphasis on potential buyers. It all felt different now, sinister even. Something was very wrong here, and I needed to understand what had happened before I made any moves. The rain had intensified outside, and the attic felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped with my growing realization that someone had deliberately hidden this will. I carefully folded the documents and placed them in my purse, my mind racing with questions that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. Should I call the lawyers immediately? Should I confront Marcus directly? Should I contact the police? I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened, who was involved, and why this will had been hidden in a secret compartment that someone clearly never expected would be discovered. As I climbed down the narrow attic stairs, I noticed something I'd missed before in my emotional state. There were fresh dust patterns on the floor near the trunk, circular marks that looked like they'd been made by someone kneeling exactly where I had just been kneeling. The dust patterns were too recent to be from my childhood games, too distinct to be accidental. Someone had been up here recently, someone other than me, searching for something. The realization sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. Had someone been looking for this will? Had they known about it and tried to find it while I was at work, grieving, trying to rebuild my life? The thought that someone might have been searching through Grandma Rose's belongings, violating her memory while I was struggling to accept my supposed inheritance of nothing, made me feel physically sick. I locked the front door carefully behind me, checking it twice before walking to my car. The familiar weight of the house key in my hand felt different now, heavier, more significant. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, watching the rain create rivers on the windshield while I tried to process what I'd discovered. The windshield wipers struggled against the heavy rain as I drove back to my small apartment across town. I lived in a modest one-bedroom place in the Pearl District, the kind of apartment that was all I could afford on my teacher's salary. The rent was too high, the walls were thin, and the heating barely worked, but it was mine. The inheritance would have changed everything. If it was legitimate, if it was real, if someone hadn't deliberately hidden it from me. That evening, I spread the documents across my kitchen table and examined them more closely under the bright overhead light. The lawyer's name was Jonathan Crawford, and his office was listed as being in downtown Portland. I'd never heard of him before, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Grandma Rose had been private about her legal affairs, and she might have switched lawyers for this final will. The witnesses were listed as Margaret Foster, described as a notary public, and David Chen, whose profession was listed as a paralegal. Neither name was familiar to me, but again, that wasn't necessarily suspicious. People often used professional witnesses for important legal documents. I spent the next 3 hours researching online, trying to find any information about these people that might help me understand what had happened. Margaret Foster appeared to be a legitimate notary public who worked in the downtown area. Her name appeared on various legal documents and business filings, which suggested she was a real person with a real profession. David Chen was more difficult to track down initially, but I eventually found a listing for a David Chen who worked as a paralegal at a law firm about 15 minutes from Jonathan Crawford's office. The timing seemed right, and the professional connection made sense. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that this will was genuine. The legal language was complex and specific, the formatting was professional, and the signatures looked authentic. But that raised even more disturbing questions that kept me awake as the night wore on. If this was real, then someone had deliberately hidden it to prevent me from inheriting. Someone had wanted me to believe I got nothing while they took everything that should have been mine. Someone had watched me grieve not just for my grandmother, but for the financial security and family connection I thought I'd lost forever. I thought about Uncle Marcus and tried to remember his behavior during the funeral and the will reading. He'd seemed genuinely surprised by the contents of the will, even commenting that he'd expected Rose to leave me something. But now I wondered if that had been an elaborate performance, a way to deflect suspicion while he secretly knew the truth. He'd been so quick to put the house on the market, so eager to get me out, so focused on his business investments that supposedly required immediate attention. He'd also been at the house frequently after Grandma Rose's death, helping with arrangements, but also having plenty of opportunity to search through her belongings. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, but I couldn't concentrate on teaching when my entire world had been turned upside down. I drove to Jonathan Crawford's law office, which was located in a well-maintained older building in the heart of Portland's legal district. The building directory listed his practice on the 4th floor. I took the elevator up, my heart pounding with each floor we climbed. The hallway was quiet, lined with frosted glass doors bearing the names of various legal practices. Crawford's office was at the end of the hall. I pushed open the door and found myself in a small reception area with comfortable chairs and legal books lining the walls. The receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her 50s with graying hair and warm eyes, looked up from her computer and smiled at me. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Crawford," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I need to speak with him about a will he prepared for my grandmother, Rose Thompson." Her expression changed immediately, becoming somber and sympathetic. "I'm so sorry, dear, but Mr. Crawford passed away about 2 months ago. It was very sudden, a heart attack. He was only 62. She paused, studying my face with concern. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I'm Mrs. Patterson, and I've been handling most of his client affairs during the transition to his partner, 2 months ago, right around the time of Grandma Rose's funeral." The timing seemed too coincidental to be mere chance. "I found this will," I said, removing the documents from my purse and showing them to her. "It's more recent than the one that was probated, and I'm trying to understand what happened." Mrs. Patterson put on her reading glasses and examined the papers carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. "This certainly looks like Mr. Crawford's work. The letterhead is correct, that's definitely his signature, and the format matches his usual style. But I don't recall seeing this file anywhere in his office, and we've been going through all his cases very carefully to ensure nothing was missed." "Is that unusual?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Very unusual." Jonathan was absolutely meticulous about his filing system. He kept detailed records of every client meeting, every document prepared, every fee collected. If he prepared this will, there should be a client file with copies of the document, notes from meetings with your grandmother, billing records, correspondence, everything. She paused, studying me more intently. "May I ask how and where you found this?" I explained about cleaning out my grandmother's house and discovering the will in the hidden compartment of the old trunk. Mrs. Patterson listened carefully, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. "I think you need to speak with the police," she said finally, her voice serious. "If this will is legitimate and it was deliberately hidden to prevent you from inheriting, that's a very serious matter. Someone may have committed fraud, and possibly worse. The timing of Jonathan's death is concerning." "What do you mean?" "Well, if someone wanted to prevent this will from being discovered, Jonathan would have been the primary obstacle. He was an honest man, very ethical. If he had prepared this will, he would have ensured it was properly filed and probated. The fact that it's missing from his files, combined with his sudden death," she trailed off, but the implication was clear. The Portland Police Bureau's downtown precinct was a modern building of glass and steel that seemed to reflect the gray October sky. I sat in the waiting area of the white-collar crime unit, clutching the will in my hands and trying to calm my racing heart. The detective I'd been assigned to meet with was named Lisa Chen, and I wondered if she might be related to David Chen, the paralegal who had witnessed the will. Detective Chen turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with short black hair and an efficient manner that immediately put me at ease. She listened to my story with growing interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions and taking detailed notes. "Hidden wills aren't uncommon," she said when I finished, leaning back in her chair. "People sometimes hide important documents in unusual places, especially older folks who lived through the Depression and didn't trust banks. But the timing of the lawyer's death is definitely concerning. Let me make some calls and see what we can find out." While she worked, I sat in the waiting area, watching other people come and go. There was a businessman reporting corporate fraud, an elderly woman who'd been scammed out of her retirement savings, a young couple dealing with identity theft. It struck me that crime came in so many forms, and that what had happened to me was just one variation on the theme of people taking what didn't belong to them. Detective Chen returned after about an hour, carrying a thick folder that suggested she'd been busy gathering information. "I've got some interesting details," she said, gesturing for me to follow her back to her office. "First, I confirmed that Jonathan Crawford did die of a heart attack 2 months ago. He was found in his office early one morning by the cleaning crew." "That's terrible," I said, though I realized I was more focused on what his death meant for my case than on the tragedy itself. "Here's what's interesting, though," she continued. "His office was broken into 3 days after his death. The police report shows it was a very targeted break-in." My stomach dropped. What was stolen? That's the strange part. Nothing obviously valuable was taken. The computers were left alone, the safe wasn't touched, it wasn't even opened. But several filing cabinets were gone through methodically. Files were scattered everywhere, but the thieves seemed to be looking for something specific. Like a will? Possibly. But here's what's even more interesting. I tracked down the witnesses to your grandmother's will. Margaret Foster, the notary, confirms she witnessed your grandmother signing a will about 6 months ago. She remembers it clearly because your grandmother was quite emotional during the signing, and she specifically asked Margaret to be extra careful with the documentation. What did she say about it? According to Foster, your grandmother was very concerned about making sure the will was properly executed. She mentioned that she'd had some family issues and wanted to make sure her final wishes were carried out exactly as she intended. Foster said she seemed worried that someone might try to contest the will or claim it was invalid. This sent a chill through me. It sounds like Grandma Rose knew someone might try to interfere with her wishes. It's possible. Now about David Chen, the other witness. This is where things get very concerning. David Chen died in a car accident 4 months ago. The room seemed to spin around me. 4 months ago? That's about a month after your grandmother updated her will, and 5 months before she died. Yes, I noticed the timing too. 2 people connected to this will are dead, I said slowly. That's not a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences like this, Detective Chen agreed. 2 people connected to this will dead within months of each other. The will mysteriously missing from the lawyer's files, and then the lawyer's office being broken into specifically to search through legal documents. Someone went to great lengths to make sure this will never saw the light of day. I felt sick. The scope of what might have happened was beginning to dawn on me. Do you think Uncle Marcus could be involved in killing people? I can't make accusations without evidence, but I think we need to look very carefully at everyone who benefited from the original will being the only one probated. Your uncle inherited everything, correct? I nodded, my mind racing. But Marcus isn't a killer. I mean, he's always been... We're not particularly close, but he's family. He taught me to ride a bike. He came to my high school graduation. I can't imagine him hurting anyone. People do surprising things when large amounts of money are involved, Detective Chen said gently. What's the total value of your grandmother's estate? I thought about the house, which was worth at least $800,000 in Portland's current market, plus her savings account, investment portfolio, and personal property. Probably well over $1 million. That's serious money. More than enough to motivate someone to commit fraud. And unfortunately, sometimes people escalate to violence when they feel cornered or threatened. She arranged for me to meet with a forensic document examiner the next day to verify the authenticity of the will. Meanwhile, she would look into the deaths of Jonathan Crawford and David Chen more closely, and also investigate the financial records of everyone involved. I want you to be very careful, she warned me as I prepared to leave. If someone has already killed 2 people to keep this will secret, they might not hesitate to hurt you too, especially now that you've found it. That afternoon, I found myself driving past Marcus's auto repair shop almost without conscious intention. I'd been there countless times over the years, but now I was seeing it with new eyes. The building looked more prosperous than I remembered, with fresh paint and new signage. There were several expensive-looking cars in the customer parking area, and I could see new equipment through the open garage doors. I parked across the street and watched as Marcus directed his employees. He seemed relaxed and confident, like a man whose financial worries had recently disappeared. He was wearing new clothes, and even from a distance, I could see that he'd gotten a haircut and seemed to have lost weight. When had he made all these improvements to his business? The timing seemed suspicious. My phone rang, startling me out of my surveillance. It was Detective Chen. "Sarah, I need you to come back to the station. We've discovered something important." 20 minutes later, I was back in her office, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. "What did you find?" I pulled the financial records for Jonathan Crawford's law firm. This is where it gets interesting. She spread several documents across her desk. 3 days before he died, Crawford received a large cash payment, $50,000, from someone who paid in person. The firm's books show it was recorded as consultation fees, but there's no record of what the consultation was about. Who paid him? According to the receipt, the payment was made by a man who identified himself as Marcus Thompson. "Your uncle." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt dizzy and had to grip the edge of her desk to steady myself. That doesn't make sense. Why would Marcus pay his own lawyer $50,000? That's what we need to find out. But Sarah, I have to ask, when did your uncle first learn about your grandmother's death? I thought back to that awful day in July when I'd found Grandma Rose in her garden, collapsed among the tomato plants she'd been tending. I called him right after the paramedics confirmed she'd passed. He was there within an hour. And he was at the house frequently after that? Yes, he helped me with the initial funeral arrangements. He was there almost every day for the first week, helping me go through her papers and organize things. A horrible realization was beginning to dawn on me. He could have gone up to the attic. He could have found the will, and then paid the lawyer to hide it. Detective Chen finished. $50,000 is a lot of money to pay for silence. But here's what's bothering me. If Crawford was willing to take money to hide the will, why did he end up dead? Something went wrong. Maybe Crawford got cold feet, I suggested. Maybe he was planning to come forward and do the right thing. That's possible. Or maybe he was blackmailing your uncle for more money. We may never know for sure, but the pattern is becoming clearer. I felt overwhelmed by the implications. Are you saying Marcus killed Mr. Crawford? I'm saying we need to investigate that possibility very seriously. A $50,000 payment to hide a will, followed by the lawyer's sudden death and a break-in at his office to search for documents? The pieces are starting to fit together in a very disturbing way. What about David Chen? Do you think Marcus killed him too? Chen's death happened before your grandmother died, which makes it more complicated. But if Chen knew about the will and was asking questions or making threats, he might have been seen as a liability. That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at the will that should have changed my life 3 months ago. I thought about all the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, feeling abandoned and forgotten by the grandmother who had been my anchor. I thought about the financial struggles I'd faced, the student loans I couldn't pay, the dreams I'd had to put on hold because I couldn't afford to pursue them. But more than that, I thought about Grandma Rose and how she must have felt, carefully preparing this will to ensure I was taken care of, only to have her final wishes ignored and her granddaughter left with nothing. Someone had stolen her last gift to me, and in doing so, had stolen a piece of her legacy. My phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. "Sarah, I know this is hard, but you really need to finish packing. The realtor is getting impatient, and I've got buyers who want to close quickly. Can you be out by this weekend?" I stared at the message, anger building inside me like a physical force. How could he look me in the eye, knowing what he'd done? How could he pretend to care about my feelings while stealing my inheritance and possibly committing murder to cover it up? I made a decision. I texted back, "I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come over tonight?" His response came quickly. "Sure, no problem. Everything okay? You sound stressed. Just come over, around 8 o'clock. I'll be there. Don't worry about the packing, Sarah." I know this is emotional for you. I spent the next 2 hours preparing for what might be the most important conversation of my life. I hid the will in my bedroom and set up my phone to record our conversation. Detective Chen had told me not to confront Marcus directly, but I needed to hear him admit what he'd done. I needed to understand why he'd been willing to destroy our family for money. At exactly 8 o'clock, Marcus knocked on my door. He looked the same as always, tall and lean, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was wearing a new jacket, I noticed, and his shoes looked expensive. It was hard to believe this man might be capable of fraud and murder. "You sounded upset in your text," he said, settling into my living room chair. "Is everything all right? I know cleaning out Rose's house has been difficult for you." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception or guilt. "I've been thinking about Grandma Rose a lot lately, about her final wishes and the will. Sarah, I know it's hard that she didn't leave you anything directly, but you have to understand she was quite elderly at the end, and sometimes older people make decisions that seem unusual to us. Maybe she thought I'd be better able to handle the financial responsibilities. What if I told you I found another will?" The change in his expression was subtle, but unmistakable. There was a tightening around his eyes, a slight shift in his posture, a momentary pause before he responded. "Another will? That's impossible. The lawyers were very thorough in their search of her papers. Were they? Or did someone make sure they didn't find it?" He stood up abruptly, and I could see his hands were shaking slightly. "Sarah, I don't know what you're getting at, but I found it, Marcus. The real will. The one where she left everything to me." For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stood there, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then he sat back down heavily, his shoulders sagging, as if a great weight had been placed on them. "Where did you find it?" he asked quietly. "In the attic, hidden in a compartment of an old trunk. Someone had been looking for it, hadn't they?" He put his head in his hands and was quiet for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears and something that looked like relief. "Sarah, you don't understand. It's not that simple." "Then explain it to me." Marcus was quiet for what felt like an eternity, his hands shaking as he rubbed his face. The silence in my small apartment was broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and the distant hum of traffic. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and filled with tears I'd never seen before. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have to believe that, Sarah. I never wanted anyone to die." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Despite everything Detective Chen had told me, despite all the evidence pointing to Marcus's involvement, hearing him actually admit to wrongdoing was still shocking. "What did you do, Marcus?" "I found the will the day after Rose died. I was helping you go through her papers, remember? You were so devastated, so overwhelmed by grief that you asked me to handle the legal documents." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I went up to the attic alone to look for any important papers, and I found it hidden in that trunk. At first, I was actually happy for you. I really was. You deserved something from her, and I knew how much you'd been hoping for some kind of inheritance. But," I prompted, though I dreaded hearing the rest. "But then I thought about my own situation. Sarah, I was in serious financial trouble. The shop was failing. I had debts I couldn't pay, and I was facing bankruptcy. I'd made some bad business decisions, invested in equipment I couldn't afford, and I was behind on my mortgage payments. When I saw that will, when I saw the amount of money involved, I saw a way out of my problems. I felt sick. So you decided to steal it. I took it, yes, but I told myself it was just temporary, that I could figure out a way to pay off my debts quickly and then find the will later. I thought maybe I could give you your inheritance after I'd solved my immediate problems. I convinced myself that you were young, that you'd be fine, that you had your whole life ahead of you to build your own wealth. But that's not what happened." He shook his head, fresh tears streaming down his face. "No, that's not what happened. I took the will to Jonathan Crawford because I knew him from some previous business dealings. I thought he might help me understand the legal implications of what I was doing, maybe help me figure out a way to delay probate or find some legal loophole. But he told you it was fraud." He was horrified. He told me what I was doing was fraud and that he'd have to report it to the authorities. He said he couldn't be party to cheating you out of your inheritance, that it went against everything he believed in as a lawyer. "So you paid him to keep quiet?" Marcus nodded miserably. $50,000. It was everything I had left in my savings account, plus money I borrowed against the shop. I thought that would be the end of it. Jonathan promised to keep the will safe and said we'd figure out a solution that wouldn't hurt anyone. He seemed to understand that I was desperate, not malicious, but then he died. Marcus looked up at me with genuine fear in his eyes. "Sarah, I swear to you on my mother's grave, I didn't kill Jonathan Crawford. Yes, I was desperate. Yes, I had committed fraud, but I'm not a murderer. I could never hurt another person, no matter how much money was involved. Then what happened to him? I don't know. Maybe the stress of keeping my secret contributed to his heart attack. Maybe it was just terrible timing, just a coincidence. But when he died, I panicked completely. I knew the will was somewhere in his office, and I couldn't let it be found during the transition to his partner or the settlement of his estate. So you broke into his office? I had to. I was terrified that the will would surface and I'd be charged with fraud and theft. I waited until the weekend when I knew the building would be empty, and I searched everywhere for that will. I went through every filing cabinet, every desk drawer, every box, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I stared at him, trying to process the full scope of what he'd done. What about David Chen? Who? David Chen, the paralegal who witnessed the will. He died in a car accident 4 months ago. Marcus looked genuinely confused and frightened. I don't know anything about that. I never even met him. I didn't know who the witnesses were until you just told me. Looking at his face, studying his body language, I found myself believing him. Marcus had always been a terrible liar, even as a child. When we were kids and he'd get in trouble, his guilt was always written all over his face. The police think you might have killed him too. The police? His face went completely white. Sarah, what have you done? I did what I had to do. I found the will, and I reported it to the authorities. Did you really think I would just let you steal my inheritance and pretend nothing had happened? I was going to make it right, he said desperately. I swear to you, I was going to find a way to pay you back, to give you what you deserved. I just needed time to get my finances sorted out. Time to do what? Watch me struggle to pay my bills while you used my money to renovate your shop? It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. I stood up, anger flooding through me like a tide. You watched me cry at the funeral, thinking Grandma Rose had forgotten about me. You watched me struggle to pay my student loans, knowing you had stolen my future. You sat there during the will reading, pretending to be surprised, while you knew exactly why I wasn't getting anything. How could you do that to family? He broke down then, sobbing into his hands like a child. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant for it to go this far. I was just so desperate, so scared of losing everything I'd worked for my whole life. I made one bad decision, and then I kept making worse decisions trying to cover it up. So you decided to take everything I should have inherited instead. I told myself it was temporary, he repeated. I thought I could fix it, make it right somehow. But then Jonathan died, and I couldn't find the will, and I started to hope that maybe it was lost forever. Maybe I could just get away with it, by selling the house and keeping all the money. Yes, he whispered. I know how it sounds. I know what I did was wrong, but I'm not a killer, Sarah. I never hurt anyone intentionally. I looked at this man who had been part of my family my entire life, and I felt a strange mix of anger, disappointment, and pity. Maybe you didn't kill anyone directly, but your actions set everything in motion. If you hadn't hidden the will, if you hadn't paid Jonathan Crawford to keep quiet, he might still be alive. I know. I think about that every day. I've barely slept since he died, wondering if I was responsible somehow. And what about David Chen? Even if you didn't kill him, someone did. Someone who wanted to make sure that will never surfaced. Marcus looked genuinely puzzled. I don't understand. I never had any contact with him. I didn't even know he existed until you mentioned him. Then who else knew about the will? Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking. Jonathan mentioned he had a partner who sometimes helped him with estate planning. He said this partner was involved in preparing the will, had reviewed it for legal accuracy. I never met him, but Jonathan referred to him several times. What was his name? I don't remember exactly. Johnson? Jackson? Something like that. Jonathan said he was very experienced with complex estate matters. My phone rang before I could ask more questions. I saw it was Detective Chen calling. I have to take this, I told Marcus. Sarah, we need to talk immediately. Can you come to the station? Actually, Marcus is here with me right now. He's been telling me about the will and what happened. Don't let him leave. We're sending a car to pick both of you up immediately. We've discovered something critical about this case. I hung up and looked at Marcus, who had gone even paler. The police are coming to get us. He nodded slowly, resignation replacing the fear in his eyes. I figured they would be, once you found the will and reported it. Sarah, before they get here, I want you to know that I'm actually grateful you found it. I've been carrying this guilt for months, and I couldn't live with it anymore. Every time I looked at you, every time you struggled with money or seemed sad about Rose's death, I felt like I was dying inside. Why didn't you just come forward? Why didn't you tell the truth from the beginning? Because I was a coward. Because I was more afraid of losing everything than I was of hurting you. I convinced myself that you were young and resilient, that you'd find a way to make it without the inheritance. I told myself that I needed the money more than you did, that I had more to lose. He looked directly at me for the first time since his confession began. But I was wrong about everything. I've lost more by lying than I ever would have by telling the truth. 20 minutes later, we were both at the police station. Marcus was taken to one interrogation room while I was brought to Detective Chen's office. The atmosphere felt different now, more urgent and serious than it had during my previous visits. "How much did he tell you?" she asked immediately. I recounted the entire conversation, including Marcus's claim that he hadn't killed anyone and his mention of Jonathan Crawford's partner. "Do you believe him when he says he's not a murderer? About not being a killer?" "Possibly. His story about the fraud matches what we've been able to piece together from the financial records, but we've discovered something else that changes everything." She opened a thick file on her desk. Jonathan Crawford had a law partner named Robert Jackson. He specialized in estate planning and worked closely with Crawford on complex will preparation. Marcus mentioned something about a partner. Here's what's interesting and deeply troubling. Robert Jackson disappeared the day after Crawford's funeral, just vanished without a trace. His office was cleaned out, his apartment was abandoned, and he hasn't been seen since. I felt a chill run down my spine. You think he's involved in the murders? I think Robert Jackson might be our real killer, and I think your uncle might have been his victim, rather than his accomplice. We've been investigating Jackson's background, and we've found some very disturbing patterns. She spread several documents across her desk, including financial records, police reports, and what looked like surveillance photos. Jackson has been suspected of embezzling from clients for years, but we've never been able to prove it. He's very sophisticated, very careful about covering his tracks. How does this connect to my grandmother's will? We think Jackson was using his position to identify wealthy elderly clients who might be vulnerable to manipulation. Your grandmother would have been a perfect target. Recently widowed, living alone, with substantial assets and a complicated family situation. The implications were starting to sink in. Are you saying he convinced her to change her will? No. I think the will leaving everything to you is genuine. I think your grandmother legitimately wanted you to inherit, but I think Jackson saw an opportunity when your uncle approached Crawford about hiding the will. What kind of opportunity? Think about it from Jackson's perspective. Here's a situation where someone is willing to pay $50,000 to hide a will. That suggests there might be even more money available if the situation is handled correctly. Jackson could have seen your uncle as a mark, someone he could manipulate and ultimately extract much more money from. I was trying to follow her logic. So you think Jackson took the money from Marcus, but then planned to betray him? I think Jackson took your uncle's money, killed Crawford to eliminate the only witness to their arrangement, and then planned to disappear with both the money and potentially the inheritance itself. But how could he get the inheritance? It was already probated in Marcus's favor. With Crawford dead and the newer will missing, Jackson might have planned to come forward later with a newly discovered copy of your grandmother's real will, but with himself named as executor or with some other provision that would give him control over the assets. The complexity of the scheme was staggering. What about David Chen? Chen was getting suspicious about the missing will. As a paralegal, he would have known that all copies of important documents should be properly filed and accounted for. When he started asking questions, Jackson saw him as a threat and eliminated him. So Marcus really didn't kill anyone? We don't think so. We think he was manipulated by someone much more sophisticated and dangerous than he is. Your uncle committed fraud, but Jackson is the one who turned the situation deadly. Detective Chen leaned back in her chair. The problem is, Jackson has disappeared completely. We've been tracking his movements, and it looks like he's been planning this for months. He liquidated his assets, closed his accounts, and vanished. He could be anywhere in the world by now. I felt a mix of relief that Marcus wasn't a killer, and frustration that the real perpetrator had escaped. Where does this leave me? Well, the will you found is definitely genuine. We've had it examined by experts, and there's no question about its authenticity. Since it's more recent than the will that was probated, it supersedes the previous will, making you the rightful heir to your grandmother's estate. And Marcus? He'll likely face charges for fraud and obstruction of justice, But given his cooperation and the fact that he was being manipulated by Jackson, he'll probably get probation and community service. He'll have to make restitution for the money he took, but that's manageable since the assets haven't been distributed yet. What are the chances of finding Jackson? Honestly, not great in the short term, but people like Jackson usually can't stay hidden forever. They're arrogant, and they tend to make mistakes. We've alerted international law enforcement, and we're monitoring his known associates. Eventually, he'll surface. That afternoon, I drove to the house that was now legally mine again. I stood in the living room where I'd spent so many happy hours with Grandma Rose, trying to process everything that had happened over the past few days. Marcus was sitting on the front porch when I arrived, looking older and more worn than I'd ever seen him. The confidence and prosperity I'd noticed at his shop were gone, replaced by the demeanor of a man who had lost everything that mattered. "I heard about Jackson," he said as I approached. "Detective Chen told me they think he was behind the murders." I sat down beside him on the steps where we'd sat many times during my childhood, usually after I'd scraped a knee or had a fight with friends. "How do you feel about that?" "Relieved, I guess. Relieved that I'm not a killer, that I didn't cause Jonathan's death directly, but also angry that I was used, that someone took advantage of my desperation to commit murder." He paused, looking out at the garden where Grandma Rose had spent so many peaceful hours, and ashamed that I let it happen, that I was so focused on my own problems that I didn't see what was really going on. "You couldn't have known Jackson was a killer. Maybe not, but I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew I was stealing from you, and I did it anyway. That's on me, regardless of what Jackson did afterward." We sat in silence for a while, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the oak trees in the front yard. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "What are you going to do now?" I thought about it. The house was worth nearly $1 million, and there were substantial savings and investments as well. I could quit teaching, travel, do anything I wanted. But sitting here in the place where I'd been happiest, I realized what I really wanted was to honor Grandma Rose's memory and rebuild our family. "I'm going to keep the house," I said, "and I'm going to help you save your business." He looked at me in surprise. "What? You'll pay back every penny you took, with interest, but I'm going to loan you the money to save your shop, at a fair interest rate, with a proper contract, everything legal and above board." "Sarah, you don't have to do that. I don't deserve your help after what I did. Maybe you don't deserve it, but I'm offering it anyway. Grandma Rose always said that family helps family, even when family makes mistakes. You made a terrible error in judgment, but you're still my uncle. You're still the person who taught me to drive and helped me with my math homework." He started to cry again. "I don't know how to make this right. We start by being honest with each other from now on. No more secrets, no more lies. If you're in trouble, you come to me. If I need help, I come to you. That's what family does." He nodded, unable to speak. 3 months later, I was sitting in the same living room, but everything felt different now. I had quit my teaching job and was using part of my inheritance to start a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping elderly people navigate legal issues and protect themselves from financial fraud. I decided to call it the Rose Thompson Foundation, ensuring that my grandmother's name would be associated with helping others avoid the kind of manipulation and theft that had nearly destroyed our family. The house felt like home again in a way it hadn't since Grandma Rose's death. I'd kept most of her furniture and decorations, but I'd also added my own touches: plants by the windows, books on the shelves, photos of friends and family throughout the rooms. I'd moved out of my cramped apartment and into the bedroom I'd occupied as a teenager, but I'd redecorated it to reflect who I was now rather than who I'd been then. Marcus's auto repair shop was thriving again, better than it had been in years. He'd paid back every penny he'd taken from the estate, with interest, and our relationship was slowly healing. It would never be exactly the same as it had been before. There would always be the memory of his betrayal between us, but it was honest now, and that was something we could build on. The legal proceedings had been complex, but ultimately satisfying. The probate court had officially recognized the will I'd found as Grandma Rose's final and valid testament, invalidating the earlier will that had been probated. Marcus had pleaded guilty to fraud charges and received 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and an order to pay restitution, which he'd already completed. Detective Chen had called me the week before with news about Robert Jackson. "We found him," she'd said with satisfaction in her voice. He was arrested trying to board a flight to Brazil under a false identity. Apparently, he'd been living in Mexico for the past few months, but he got overconfident and decided to try to move to a non-extradition country. What will happen to him? He's being charged with 2 counts of murder, fraud, embezzlement, and a dozen other crimes. With the evidence we have, he's looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial was still months away, but I felt a sense of closure knowing that Jackson would face justice for what he'd done. Jonathan Crawford and David Chen would never get their lives back, but at least their families would see their killer held accountable. I'd also received closure in another way. Among Grandma Rose's papers, I'd found a journal she'd kept during her final months. In it, she'd written extensively about her decision to change her will and her concerns about family dynamics. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before her death, had brought tears to my eyes. I've been thinking so much about Sarah lately. She's grown into such a wonderful young woman, but I worry about her financial security. Marcus is doing well with his business, and he doesn't need my help the way Sarah does. I've decided to change my will to leave everything to her. I hope Marcus will understand that this isn't about love or favoritism. It's about need and responsibility. Sarah has always been the light of my life, and I want to make sure she has the foundation she needs to build a good future. Another entry, written just days before her death, was even more poignant. I've been having dreams about Helen lately, my dear daughter who left us too soon. In my dreams, she tells me that Sarah is her greatest gift to the world, and that I need to take care of her daughter the way Helen would have if she'd lived. I think changing the will was the right decision. Sarah will use the inheritance wisely, and she'll honor our family's memory. Reading these entries had finally given me peace about Grandma Rose's intentions. There had never been any doubt in her mind about what she wanted to do, and she'd been thinking clearly and rationally when she made her decision. I often found myself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If I hadn't knocked over that trunk, if I hadn't discovered the hidden compartment, if I hadn't had the courage to fight for what was rightfully mine, everything would have been different. Marcus would have gotten away with his fraud, Jackson might have escaped justice indefinitely, and I would have spent the rest of my life believing that my grandmother had forgotten about me. But perhaps most importantly, if I hadn't found the will, I never would have discovered the truth about what kind of person I really was. The experience had tested me in ways I'd never been tested before, forcing me to decide whether I would fight for what was right or simply accept what seemed easier. I'd chosen to fight, and in doing so, I'd discovered reserves of strength and determination I hadn't known I possessed. I'd learned that I could face difficult truths, navigate complex legal and emotional situations, and ultimately forgive someone who had betrayed me without forgetting the lessons that betrayal had taught me. The Rose Thompson Foundation was already helping dozens of elderly clients navigate estate planning, identify potential fraud, and protect themselves from predators like Robert Jackson. Every person we helped felt like a small victory for Grandma Rose's memory and a continuation of the values she'd tried to instill in me. Marcus had become one of our volunteers, using his experience with financial desperation and fraud to help identify warning signs in other families. It was part of his community service, but it had also become something more, a way for him to transform his guilt and shame into something constructive. "I can't undo what I did," he'd told me recently, as we worked together on a case involving an elderly man whose nephew was pressuring him to change his will. "But maybe I can help prevent other families from going through what we went through." One evening, as I sat in Grandma Rose's favorite chair by the fireplace, I thought about the note she'd attached to the will. "For my dear Sarah, who brought light back into my life when I thought all hope was lost." At the time I'd first read it, I'd focused on the inheritance, on the money and property she was leaving me. But now I understood that the real gift wasn't the house or the savings account. It was the knowledge that I had been loved, valued, and remembered. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet filled with the presence of happy memories and the promise of a future built on honesty and love. I'd filled the rooms with the sound of friends visiting, with laughter and conversation, and the kinds of gatherings Grandma Rose had always enjoyed hosting. I never did finish packing to leave. Instead, I'd unpacked my life here, in the place where I'd always belonged. The will that no one was supposed to see had given me more than just financial security. It had given me back my family, my home, my sense of purpose, and my future. Every morning when I woke up in this house, I felt grateful. not just for the inheritance, but for the courage I'd found to fight for it. I'd learned that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight for ourselves, for our own dignity and worth. And sometimes, those battles lead us exactly where we're supposed to be. The foundation continued to grow, helping more families every month. Marcus's shop was busier than ever, and he'd started teaching financial literacy classes for small business owners, sharing the hard lessons he'd learned about debt and desperation. Detective Chen had become a friend, and she often referred cases to our foundation when she encountered elderly victims of financial fraud. "You've turned something terrible into something beautiful," she told me recently. "Your grandmother would be proud." As I sat in that familiar chair, surrounded by the warmth and memories of the house that was now truly mine, I thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by the events that began with a hidden will in an old trunk. Jonathan Crawford and David Chen had lost their lives, but their deaths had ultimately led to justice and prevented other potential victims from falling prey to Robert Jackson's schemes. Marcus had lost his innocence and his self-respect, but he'd gained self-awareness and a chance to make amends. I had lost my naive trust in family loyalty, but I'd gained independence, purpose, and the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. And Grandma Rose, even in death, had achieved her final wish, ensuring that I had the foundation I needed to build a meaningful life and the resources to help others along the way. The rain that had been falling the day I discovered the will had given way to clear skies and sunshine. As I looked out at the garden where Grandma Rose had spent her final morning, I could see new growth emerging from the soil she'd tended so carefully. Like the garden, our family had weathered a destructive storm, but we were growing again, stronger and more resilient than before. The will that no one was supposed to see had ultimately revealed the truth about all of us, our weaknesses and our strengths, our capacity for betrayal, and our potential for redemption. And every day, I was grateful for the courage to keep digging until I found what had been hidden, and for the wisdom to know that some discoveries are worth fighting for, no matter how difficult the battle might be.